Okay, for this video, we're going to discuss something called a maximal flow problem. Maximal flow problem tries to, or doesn't try to, it actually discovers what capacity is possible along a network. So this network might be roads, and therefore it would represent how much traffic a system of roads could handle. Could be plumbing, could be telecommunications, but we're trying to figure out how much traffic in this particular example can get from or can continuously get through this system between nodes 1 and node 7 utilizing all of the, let's say, roads. So to give this some context, perhaps node 1 is Oklahoma City, perhaps node 7 is Tulsa, and we have all of these different ways you could go from one to the other. We want to know how many cars could get there in a particular time frame. So what we have on each of these arcs are capacities. So for example, if you look at arc connecting nodes 1 and 2, you see a 4 there. And that tells you that perhaps 4, let's say, 1,000 cars could travel that particular route in, let's say, an hour. So that 4 is some type of capacity, thousands of cars per hour, terabytes per second if it's telecommunications, millions of gallons per day, so this is some type of capacity. So let's say 4,000 cars can travel between node 1 and node 2 in an hour. If you look at nodes 2 and 5, you'll see that there's an arrow going both directions, and you see a 3 on the top, a 3 on the bottom. And what that's telling us is 3,000 cars can go from node 2 to node 5 in an hour, and 3,000 cars can go from node 5 to node 2 in an hour. So all of these are capacities, and what we're trying to figure out is, okay, how many cars can go all the way through this network in one particular hour. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to do something that'll seem kind of simple, and we're going to add this fake arc. I'm going to start at node 7, and I'm going to go all the way around, and I'm going to go back into node 1. And you may have to pause and think about this, but if we simply ask our optimal solution to maximize x71, where x71 represents the amount of cars traveling in an hour from node 7 back through node 1, and then we impose constraints at every single node that ensure that what comes out of each node must equal what goes into that node, then what we've done is we've created this loop, okay? And the results of our objective function represent how much traffic could continuously flow throughout this loop. And what that effectively does is it pulls, if you will, as much traffic as possible through this network that exits node 7 and then comes back and does it again. So what we've got to do is add this imaginary loop, if you will, and then our objective function is relatively simple. It's just to maximize x71. And again, x71 is not binary in this example as it has been in some of the other problems. x71 represents the amount of traffic flowing from node 7 to node 1. And more generically, xij represents the amount of traffic flowing from node I to node j. So for every single arc up there, you'll have a decision variable. If the arc is pointing in both directions, then you'll have two decision variables. For example, there is an x24, the amount of traffic traveling from node 2 to node 4. And there's also an x42, the amount of traffic traveling from node 4 to node 2. So we've got two types of constraints in this problem. And you'll have a ton of constraints before we're done. I'm not going to write them all out here, but I'm going to give you examples. The first type of constraint is the what goes in equals what comes out constraint. So a bottleneck could occur here. It could be that we could have capacity of a dozen leaving a particular node, but the capacity coming into that node is only 8. Well, you're going to constrain what can come out of that node. Well, let's look at those constraints. Let's look at node 2, and we'll begin with that constraint. Node 2's constraint, again, what goes in equals what comes out. If we look at all the arrows going into node 2, we have x12 plus x42 plus x52. So this represents all of the traffic coming to that particular node. And then that has to equal all of the traffic leaving that particular node. So that would be x25 plus x24 in this particular example. So this is the what comes out has to equal what goes in, or what goes in equals what comes out in this in the way I've written it. So you will have a constraint like this for every single node, including node 7 and node 1. So let's do node 7 now that we have this dummy loop, this dummy decision variable called x71. We have a constraint that says what goes into node 7, x57 plus x47 plus x67 must equal x71. Everything coming in has to equal what's coming out. Okay, so when you maximize x71, do you see that you're maximizing the left-hand side of this equation? You're maximizing all of the traffic coming into that. And similarly, you'll have a constraint that pertains to node 1 that says x71, everything going into node 1, must equal x12 plus x14 plus x13. Okay, so in this way, every single node has a constraint that says what comes in must equal what comes out. Okay, that's going to ensure you don't have 5 cars arrive and 10 leave, which of course is not possible. So these constraints impose reality. The other type of constraint are the capacity constraints. So for every single number you see in our diagram, there's a constraint. And I won't write them all, but I'll get started. It says x12, for example, must be less than or equal to 4. So let's talk about that for a minute. That's this 4 right here in the upper left-hand corner. And x12, again, what is xij? It's the number of cars moving from node 1 to node 2 in thousands in an hour. So x12 has to be less than or equal to 4. That constraint is going to ensure that we don't try and have 5,000 cars traveling, for example. So this would get really monotonous if I went through and did this for every single constraint. But I'll do a couple more. x14 must be less than or equal to 4. x13 must be less than or equal to 3, and so on and so forth. The last constraint might be x67 must be less than or equal to 5. So you'll have one of those types of constraints for every single number you have in that diagram. You'll have one of these types of constraints, these what goes in equals what comes out, for every single node on your diagram. And this is the maximal flow problem. So what have we done? We've simply created this fake loop that goes around. So now we have a circular flow of traffic, and it should be somewhat intuitive that if we can maximize the traffic on node 7.1 constrained by the entire network, then we can determine the maximum capacity that the network can handle. So we just simply have an objective function that says maximize x71. And we have two types of constraints. Again, to review, we've got those constraints that say whatever's leaving has to equal whatever came in. So there's imposing some reality there. If you're leaving, you had to get here from somewhere. And the second type of constraints are those capacity constraints, that this road can only handle this many cars per hour in this example. And it's that simple. That's how you formulate a maximal flow problem.